Thanks so much for asking me to be here. It's really terrific to get to share my views, which is in this group, which most of you I don't know, as opposed to sharing them with lots of people I do know makes it pretty interesting for me. And also I've already learned so much, particularly the corporate perspective was very interesting. I find myself, though, in a limiting position because I stand between lunch, which as my tummy started to grumble just a moment ago. So hopefully you can keep your thinking hats on, because I might sort of throw a perspective out that many of you who are sort of fearful of government may not actually embrace too well. So if we could bring my presentation up, that would be great. Thanks. And then I assume it's my job to put this forward. This presentation is as much my own journey. I started Root Cause in 2004, as it is hopefully a perspective that will add value today. I founded Root Cause in early 2004, but I've been teaching in the field of social innovation and entrepreneurship for over 10 years now, currently both at the Sloan School at MIT as well as Harvard. And there we go. I will only say one word about Root Cause because it really builds off to talk about that journey. This vision is held true even through a recent planning process we went through, and I think it's an important one to note. It's about the world in which all three sectors are working together, and this is an important note as we think about the role of philanthropy versus markets to invest and reinvest, because I think the concept of investing and reinvesting, which the private sector can do so well, whether through capital markets or through its ability to reinvest its profits, is very difficult to find in solving social problems, and also in our ability to really find what is really working out there efficiently, effectively, and sustainably to deal with social issues overall. So I want to echo the point around the ecosystem. I think to build off this vision, we at Root Cause are slowly trying to figure out what it looks like to have an ecosystem of social innovation. And what we know is that that ecosystem actually has to involve all three sectors. Since our early inception, which is not that long ago, most of our work has really concentrated in that upper left-hand corner with the NGO. We were founded as the basis of our work as a strategy consulting firm, although we're a nonprofit, working with NGOs in the USA to help them scale based on philanthropic funding. We have not done very much work at all at this point in the for-profit sector, but I was fortunate enough to be asked to write a couple of papers on social entrepreneurship, and the first for the Small Business Administration's report to the President, and then with the Aspen Institute, and chose to explore how linking that world, which is emerging, and we've been doing a lot of work with government. And so for the last 3 years, both through thinking and practice, we've really started to dig very deep about how those two worlds intersect. That paper started with a strong analysis, and most of my work is USA-based, so my apologies for what may be, and I'm starting to learn a lot of activities across the world with the three sectors' different roles and how incredibly robust their growth has been. The private sector has been incredibly powerful at utilizing markets to exchange goods and services for profit, to drive productivity and innovation. In the US, generating one of the largest world economies, with huge growth both in GDP as well as the expansion of an employment base. The public sector's role, or one of its important roles, has been to respond to market failures, and I was glad to hear someone mention it. One of the important things that government has played a role in since the establishment of government institutions is that as capitalist societies drive markets, there are failures that happen because capitalism drives market failures, whether it be limited ability to get access to education or healthcare or anything like that, and that they are trying to provide public goods and services through redistribution. Sorry.
You can talk here.
Oh, I see. Okay, gotcha. Okay. This response to market failures has been a very strong role for government over time. What emerged very recently is this voluntary or nonprofit sector, which is really engaging individuals to perform action for the performance of social impact. At first, it was very voluntary oriented, and only recently have we really started to establish a strong, real nonprofit sector that actually has many organizations with budgets acting much like businesses, but just with no return to their so-called investors, but instead starting to think about a return to social impact. In the United States alone, it now represents $1.4 million organizations, over $1 billion in revenue, and those employee numbers are probably most important because it's actually been the fastest growing sector in the USA today. What my paper explored was that there have been an enormous number of actual trends that have been going on in all three sectors, and what I think has emerged from those is this concept of social innovation and entrepreneurship right at the heart of it overall. You've seen on the government side extreme demands for efficiency, re-entrance of business and nonprofit providers doing what government didn't do. So sometime in the Reagan era, you went from a development of programs by the government to a significant outsourcing of roles by the government. On the nonprofit side, you've seen much more greater demands on accountability and sustainability, so you see much more interest on earned income strategies and things of those sort. And on the private sector side, they're getting in the game. They're actually providing services, whether they be school services or prison services. You also have other things like corporate social responsibility emerging, public-private partnerships, and things like that. And I think what's really at the heart of this is the exploration of entrepreneurial innovative thinking to solve social problems. I want to take a moment to just talk about the social innovation and entrepreneurship from a market failure continuum perspective, because I think this is important to distinguish between the for-profit ability to find a market and realize a return based on that industry, and the social innovation or entrepreneur that's actually responding to a social problem from a market failure perspective. And this gets to philanthropy or earned income, or what does it mean? I think that we have to say that there's a continuum, and they're not all problems can be solved by one solution. There is a no market opportunity in which the reality is that there is not going to be a way to make money off that market. Public education, I think, is a really good example of that. You're going to need, whether it be philanthropy or tax dollars, and if you can find a way to make money off that, domestic violence is another example, I think it's quite challenging. There are also what I would call limited market opportunities. These are those opportunities where there is actually a mix of philanthropy and earned income, and that dual degree of those different types of earned revenue as well as philanthropy can find some really interesting sustainable models. And then finally is what I would call a low profit market. Very often these are for-profit companies who are getting a less than generating rate of return based on the industry they're in. They may actually move into a for-profit typical rate of return opportunity as well. There are good examples of these that actually the companies can be sold and they can find real returns. All three of these, though, their primary motivation is to deal with a social issue. All three of these I found are generally working at different parts of a client along the continuum. Now, the challenge for me as I was writing these two papers was that I believe as we started to do our work that we were actually really only scratching the surface. In the for-profit sector, we have a situation in which every company wants a monopoly. And what you do is you try to capture that monopoly for as long as you can until competitive interests come in, and the government actually tries to prevent monopolies. In the social problem-solving space, no one of the organizations that you either represent or invest is going to solve any of these issues. And that's why my comments earlier about spread are so important. If you take some of the organizations that have the largest scale, and then you take the problem they're dealing with at the city, the state, the federal, or national level, their market share is tiny. And so rather than us try to figure out how to create more replication, we have to actually start to figure out how to spread. And that's why I turn back to government. Government has access to all the systems. Government makes all the laws. Government provides the majority of the funding in our country, let alone the countries where government is really the only game in town. And in many times, government actually provides most of the direct service. And we have to recognize this reality at this time as social innovation and entrepreneurship is actually getting on the scene. So why is this important? Well, I think we're at a very interesting point in history right now where many of the topics like today are being brought up at a variety of different conferences that used to be a niche are now becoming mainstream. And we're also at an inflection point where we're recognizing that many of these massive social problems that we're facing, if we don't fix them, The capital markets are going to have a challenge as well, like education, for example. So we envision a new role for government, what we call the public innovator. It's a facilitator as opposed to a direct provider, and it's about really thinking to ourselves as how government can be spreading what works and can start to think about a new role for them in 6 different areas. One of them is to think, how do they go out and now encourage social innovation? The next is, how do they foster a supportive policy environment? The third is, how do they reward initiatives for exceptional performance? The fourth is to scale successful approaches. The fifth is to produce knowledge, to understand performance, and measurement is a big point that I think we need to really take a long, hard look at and start to get really good at. And the sixth is to catalyze public-private partnerships across sectors. These may seem new to you, or they may not because you've actually done a lot of work in business, but they actually really are built off of when the government started to really encourage entrepreneurship and innovation and figure out what its role was, opposed to owning it, trying to facilitate it, and we need to get government to do the same thing. Let me give just a couple of quick examples. I have, in my Aspen paper, quite a number of recommendations built off models that have existed already. So let's take one on encouraging social innovation. If we just allocated a small percentage of any agency budget towards encouraging social innovation, imagine the competitive learning we would get. Charter schools are an amazing example. All that was taking the public budget of a public school and peeling off 2 or 3%. And we see the challenges that put on our own public education system, I argue, in a good way. And now our own current administration is putting it out as a shining example. There's also the opportunity to foster a supportive policy environment, and that's by starting to establish government institutions so they can begin to explore what their role might be. A couple of examples in our own country. One is the Texas Center for Social Impact that we're working very closely with, that uniquely has a research arm, a training arm, and an encouraging social innovation and entrepreneurship arm. And as you heard earlier, while just launched, is really trying to explore the role in Washington right now, the launch of the White House Office of Social Innovation. These are just a couple of examples, and we could talk about more. But I believe, just to finish out, that we need to figure out what a social innovation agenda looks like by working with government to spread what works. We are not accelerating impact. The amount of money that we have been spending over the last quarter century on different social issues, while at the same time the kind of acceleration on any given social issue, the return from my perspective just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't add up at all. However, we need to think about this amazing ability to generate citizens in our country and around the world who are generating innovative and entrepreneurial ideas for social problems, and connect them back to government so they can help to try to figure out what their role was, which was their original role, quite honestly, and develop this feedback loop in which government finds its role as citizens generate more ideas and scale what works in a systematic way overall. If I could just say one last thing and then I'll step down. There was a lot of information here. It's theoretical, although root cause prides itself in practical too. My one message as we continue to talk about this meeting is that there are 2 reasons why government doesn't seem to be ever at the table in these conversations, and we have to figure out how to get them to the table. Either one of them is that they're too bureaucratic and they're going to ruin everything, or the other one is, I didn't really want to recognize them because we can do it on our own and we'll just leave them over there to do their work. Either one of them is a misnomer right now because they're going to come to the table, and in fact they've already been at the table. If you think about any issue we've been working on, it will always trace back to government. So I encourage us all to really think hard as we explore today and tomorrow about the role of sustainable development, how government can more proactively partner with us before they start to do it on their own, and then maybe they will screw it up. Thanks.